Hello everyone. Here's a Bamford EV1 petrol engine which I've had together for about a week now, and it's running pretty good now, so I thought I'd do a little video and include some tips on how to get these running for those who might be doing the same thing. Certainly all new to me. So this is an EV1 Spec C. It is a 1.5 brake horsepower at 700 RPM. It's extremely heavy. So the power to weight ratio is pretty low, I should think. It's got a Solex carb on the top, and there you can see the choke flap there. So you just hold that over there while you start it. There's an exhaust, which part of it is original. This is all new. You can actually still buy these from Bamfords, would you believe? And they've still got the original castings. It's got a really crude governor mechanism where you can see this controls the throttle, and if you look through between the flywheel, you can see there is a shoe on a collar, and that's driven by these weights. So if I can't move it by hand, but there we go. And it's got a extremely crude linkage which moves the throttle around, and that's actually quite a good way of controlling the idle rate temporarily, just to rev it up and rev it down, as you'll see later. The actual method by which you set the idle speed is either where this flywheel sits on the crankshaft, or actually there's a couple of bolts in there which you can move, and they change the spring preload on that collar, so to alter the amount of force that the weights have to exert. It's a bit of copper fuel line to the fuel tank, which was originally painted green, but it's so rare that anything's made of copper these days I couldn't bear to paint it, so I just polished it up. A note about painting actually is that once you put oil in this thing, it's going to come out probably around the bottom, where the sump is. The whole thing hinges over on that thing, and so you're bound to get a bit of seepage. So if you fire it up before you've painted it, the chances are you're not going to be able to get the paint to stick, or you're going to have to wash everything down very thoroughly to repaint it. So on this one, I made all the gaskets, put it all together completely dry, and then had it fully painted before I attempted to run it, which is a rare bit of discipline for me, I think. This hinged sump arrangement actually apparently was a patented thing for Bamford, and so it's got four bolts around the edge, and you can hinge the whole thing over and get access to the bottom end. The crank actually has the bottom of the connecting rod has a little scoop that picks up oil in the sump. The oil level is just level with the top of that. There's a gasket in there to stop it seeping out, and then you can see the top of the white metal bearings on the crank. The crank actually has a flinger ring, so any oil that seeps along the crank and gets into that void there actually gets flung off, and then there's a little hole where there's a drain. So you've got to make sure you get those bearings in the right way, because otherwise you won't get oil in from the top, and then any oil that you do go in won't seep back into the sump. I don't think, actually thinking about it, I don't think they fit either way anyway, but it's an interesting thing nonetheless. And it was extremely difficult to start when I first had a go at this, and that was primarily due to the magneto. There's a spark plug at the top there, you can see. This magneto is a RS 1.2, which differs from the RS 1, which is used on a load of listers, in that it rotates in the other direction. So it rotates counterclockwise. And it was all about the adjustment in the back, because while I had what I thought was a reasonable spark, it wasn't really hot enough to give good ignition. So and that all came down to the points gap, and I've since realised that if the points don't break at the point where there's maximum current flowing in the windings, you're not going to get the best spark that you can. And while I had a spark, it just wasn't hot enough. So now it's pretty good. It will, just with the plug in open air, it will certainly spark the plug, turning it over about once a second, and certainly twice a second you get a nice hot spark. And that's going to differ when it's under compression. You need a higher voltage under compression, but it seems to work okay. It's a pity this one's missing the stop and run switch, which I haven't attempted to put back. But fortunately, if I close the throttle by hand on the car, it does actually stop running. Not a lot else to say, I don't think. I've put some water in it. The oil, it recommends in the documentation SAE 30, which, as it happened, I managed to buy. You can still get it, but you have to work a bit harder than you used to. So that's about it. The only other thing I should say is that there is a mark on the flywheel which wasn't obvious to me the first time I started it, but there is a spark mark there. So while the timing of the points on the magneto is important to give you a nice hot spark, obviously the timing of the magneto is also important. And then you can fine-tune that with a grub screw as a roller chain that transmits the motion through to the magneto, and there's just a grub screw on the lower sprocket, so you can adjust that without too much difficulty. The only other thing is I got the starting handle for it, which now I realise, now it's sparking and igniting a lot more efficiently. There's a lot more chance it's going to backfire and take your thumb off. And I have heard people say that you're not supposed to wrap your thumb around the starting handle. You're supposed to just wrap all your fingers and thumbs around it the same way. The thing is, I think if I did that, the chances are I'd end up with a starting handle spinning around on there until it flew off somewhere. So generally what I've started to do now is to wind this right back, so that by the time I start winding it, I've got a reasonable amount of momentum and I can get it past the first revolution without any chance of it backfiring. I did actually have to try and start this with an electric drill, and I would avoid that at all costs, because I ended up with the electric drill spinning around on there in the end. So not a good idea. Anyway, let's see if we can get this to go. I will just turn on a few fans and open the door, and then we'll see how it goes. And the only other thing I'd say is that since the exhaust exits to the right into my left ear, I'm going to wear ear defenders as well, because when it first fires it's really loud. So there we go. Runs alright, doesn't it? I think it's running a bit rich, and one of the reasons for that, because it's not adjustable, there is some bleed air adjustment on the top of the carburettor, but it doesn't seem to do very much. And there is also you can change the extremes of adjustment for the throttle by means of 2 screws under here, but again that doesn't really control the mixture. But what I think is, because I've got it mounted on this trolley, the whole thing is hopping up and down, and the float is actually bouncing up and down in the float chamber. So what we're ending up with is a higher level of fuel in the carb than there should be, and so it's running richer than it should be. So the next step would be to get it mounted, well, either screwed down to the ground, which I'm not going to do, or mounted on something pretty substantial so it doesn't jump up and down. But yeah, that's it. So I hope that's of help to someone. See you later.